Hello, um, January 7th, 2021. We're right in the middle of Trump's nonsense here. I knew it was coming. I knew he's in full collapse. You didn't know it was coming. I've known Trump a long time, since the beginning. You haven't known Trump's pathology because psychologists are not allowed to make diagnostic statements about people unless we've interviewed them. That needs to change. Trump exhibited enough symptoms of his mental illness that professional psychology should have been allowed to weigh in on that factor. It was a relevant issue in the considerations of the elections, whether or not the person running is psychologically stable. And professional psychology needs to look at their own liability and responsibilities in that. We don't politics, and yet at the same time, when it's a clear issue, there needs to be professional responsibility relative to that. At least educating the public about issues of delusional disorders and shared delusional disorders. I think Psychological Association has a professional responsibility at this point to address the issues of shared delusional disorders, things like conspiracy theories and election fraud conspiracy theories that will continue to the psychotic world. The other issue of relevance in the general population relative to the psychopathology that we are looking at is the psychopathology of pathological hatred and pathological anger. Now, a group of this mob, and most of them I would probably estimate, are what I would call yahoos. They were Trump's yahoos, and people are calling them domestic terrorists. I wouldn't put them that place. There are a component that was part of that group, but most are I would classify as yahoos. They're the flying monkey version of the pathology. It's a social distribution feature. I think of the social distribution feature like that slime mold. They're individual organisms, but they come together in like a big mat and form a multicellular organism of a whole bunch of individual ones. And so it's like a slime mold kind of thing, where this, I call it meme structure in their head, this distorted thought disorder pulls them together into this shared delusional state. And it's just like a matting of this state. And it's a shared delusional disorder. And so you will see that's a major component of it. Delusion. They feel people are out to get them. That there's a malevolent infrastructure world that is persecuting them. That's a persecutory delusion. And so there was, and Aaron Beck, early on with this, I looked into pathological hatred in Aaron Beck's book on pathological hatred. And he made an interesting point, which is the pathology of hatred sees itself as a victim. And so the Nazis in Germany saw themselves in Germany as a victim of the Jews. And so the pathology always sees itself as a victim. And so you can see that in the Trump cult. They believe they're being victimized, and they're fighting out and lashing out against what they believe is domination. Oh, we're forcing them to wear masks, or we got all this whatever, this domination of them that they are trying to, or perceive themselves to be rebelling against, which is a Confederate flag. They're rebels, and don't tell me what to do, because they see themselves rebelling against domination. That's the persecutory delusion. Now, in fact, that's a projection, because they are the ones who are seeking to dominate. And I want to get to that in a second. So there's a lot of projection here. And that's because this is a delusional disorder. This is about as collapsed as a psychological structure becomes, is a delusion. And when you reach that level of pathology, the two psychological defenses you get are denial and projection. So the moment we're in delusional world, we know those are the two psychological defenses because those are at the bottom. And so you get right before they hit the bottom, you're going to get projection. And that's what we see. They say, oh, you're trying to steal the election. No, there's no election fraud. You're trying to steal the election. That's a projection. And it's clearly a projection. And they say, oh, we're American patriots. No, you're taking over the Capitol in a mob. You're not a patriot. And so they're projecting their own. Oh, the liberals are dangerous. No, you're dangerous. What if one of your Yahoo people had brought in a bomb? You didn't bring in the bomb, but one of your Yahoo people brings in a bomb and blows up and kills members of Congress. What are you thinking? You're not. You're delusional. You got this thing going. So, and then we get to denial. And you're going to see a lot of that because that's what happens when you collapse a delusion. Now, the rest of in the world, including everybody in America, is going to see that this is crazy, except the shared delusion. It can't see itself. And so they're going to go into denial. Excuse me. And so if that's going to be exposed, everybody's going to see the denial. And it's going to be really weird for people to see it because they go, how can you not see denial? That's the symptom. And you people aren't recognizing that. Which brings me to my first point relative to the political issue. That up till now, I have been taking a very hard line on the politics of it and really bashing Trump really hard and Trump voters because it's my effort to wake people from that delusional state. So if you're capable of extracting yourself from the shared delusion, it's the challenges called confrontation. It's the confrontations that will get you off. Because delusions, you can't argue with them. I worked 12 years on a schizophrenia project. It's impossible to argue with a delusion because it's delusional. There's no argument with it. It goes right to denial, and if you go beneath the denial, it goes dissociative. So there's no arguing with a delusion. So trying to convince the Trump cult mind, pointless. It's absolutely pointless. There is the ability perhaps to get some who are not quite in the delusion to disengage. And you see that now with Trump doing this. You see all the Republicans have now, poof, and they're like, oh my God, this guy's crazy. Yeah. And you should have known that ahead of time, which is an interesting point on parallel process. What you're going to see here is you're going to see a lot of accountability now for the previous enablers, people like Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell and the former impeachment. We tried to impeach this guy, but you enablers stopped and left him in office. And now look what's happened. We got 12 days and we got a crazy president because you didn't impeach him when you should have. You didn't do your job. And so it's the enablers who are going to be exposed, which is part of the process. In parallel process over here, the enabler is going to be forensic psychology. And they're going to be looking in the same situation. If they switch to using established knowledge, they're going to admit they didn't do it before and that they were unethical. Yikes, that opens up for a lot of liability. But if they don't switch to established knowledge, they are currently unethical and they're going to hit with licensing board complaints and malpractice lawsuits. So either way, the allies who enabled the pathology of parental alienation, of that shared delusion and stuff because they were ignorant, incompetent, and negligent in their professional practice, they're kind of stuck. They're like Lindsey Graham now and Ted Cruz and everybody who support the president and enabled his capacity to attack Congress with a mob. They're going to be exposed. Now, we can't do that yet because we still got 12 days of Trump. That's the important thing to recognize about narcissistic pathology. It moves from crisis to crisis to crisis to crisis. Whatever happened to the Russian attack on our security systems? Russians got into all our security and computer and like, oh my goodness, what happened to that? In the news cycle with all this other chaos. Because the next day's chaos just overwhelms the previous days. And I'm sure all targeted parents are familiar with this in your fight. You can't keep up with the narcissistic parent on the amount of chaos they cause. And yet when you go into court and you try to tell the judge that both need to, no, you don't, it's not a both thing. It's not Democrats and Republicans doing this. This is not normal. Now, in normal world, yes, both Democrats and Republicans, but this is not normal world. And that's what court involved psychology. The judges in high custody conflict cases need to understand that this high conflict custody pathology is not normal world. Okay, in normal world, normal family conflict, I'll maybe hold both parents kind of responsible and say this is a issue because it's always triangles. And so that's normal world. That's not high conflict divorce. High conflict divorce, we're dealing with a Trump-like personality, a narcissistic pathology. They are chaos. They are argumentative. They fight about everything. It is impossible to work with them. They dominate, they force submission, and they get the child to submit and use the child as a weapon against the other parent, just as Trump would try to use, the mob against Congress. And so his mob people are the child. They're Americans. And he deludes them with lies and turns them against Congress. This is the parental alienation pathology. It's just alienating Americans from America. And you can see it. It's a parallel process because it's the same pathology. It's the collapse of narcissistic personality pathology into delusions. And we know that from Milan and other people. We know that. And so this is a parallel process that can be used once the chaos stops to explain and highlight the features of the pathology for the court and judges, because our justice system, our family law system, needs to revisit this issue. Everybody's going to need to revisit the issue. Security about the Capitol needs to be revisited. The whole radicalization of the right wing needs to be revisited. Fox News is going to be, everything's going to be revisited once we get some time away from daily chaos. I mean, just you can't keep up with the news cycle. And even this attack on the Capitol is potentially going to be replaced in a couple of days by something else. It's interesting that, it's inevitable that the 25th Amendment is going to come up, because Trump is going to collapse and he's going to keep getting worse. And at some point, he's going to, when he's not elected, he's going to go off the deep end. Now, as a clinical psychologist, I'm watching the election and I'm going, 40% of the country is voting for this guy? This is even close? You want to elect a pick president for the next 4 years? The guy's like, and now we're talking about 25th Amendment to remove him from office, where a month ago you were going to give him 4 more years. You people are immensely irresponsible with your vote. Problem with Republicans and your small government, and I don't like government either, and I have no problem with your Republicans. Deficit, oh God, we're spending money for our kids' money, and I got no problem with the ideological discussions. Okay. But holy cow, people, this is not a political discussion. And so you Republicans, because it's not Democrat, it's not equal, okay? No, you Republicans need to self-evaluate. You need to talk to Sean Hannity and Fox News and get them under control about radicalizing the fears of your far right. Because you need to cut them off, these shared delusional people, or you become the party of the shared delusion, party of QAnon. QAnon will define your party if you let them in. Okay, you're a bunch of delusional party. We're going to have to find a non-delusional second party because the second party has gone off the deep end. Or you got to come back. Mitt Romney will bring you back. Somebody who's stable. I don't agree with Mitt Romney about much, but he'll bring you back. Romney, and that will bring you back a little bit. I met his father George, I was like in San Antonio Famous Fair, and he's running for president. I shook his hand, George Romney. And George was a moderate. He's a Michigan governor. He was a moderate Republican. And my dad kind of liked him. He was kind of going either way on that because he likes moderate. And so Romney is also Mormon, which is a value system. Again, I may not agree with the Mormon values and things, but there is a strong ethical values within the Mormon culture. And you can see that in Mitt Romney, that he never got on the Trump train. He always said, this guy is bad news and this guy's wrong. And he had the courage to stand up to him because that is what it takes. Courage. And all the other Republicans, cowards, 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 and that'll be exposed. And that's what's going to happen. Kasich, too, another person of values. The Republican Party needs to return to is your moral values. And you need to kick the psychotic people out because they have the wrong values. Moral values, right and wrong kind of stuff. Because if you align and you exploit people who are immoral, who are unpatriotic, who are un-American, you become a party of the un-American. That's your party. And so don't exploit them, but you'll lose power. It's your choice. Are you going to sell your soul for power? Don't do it. If you do it, that's a bad choice. And a different party will come up who will have value systems. But it'll take 20 years and there'll be a chaos. And so I think the Republicans want to return, and a lot of them do, Cheney and other people, but that's the issue. It's morality and moral values, right? I kick out the crazy because they will define you, and stop radicalizing. The other issue relative to Trump is, up till now, I've been taking a political line because I'm doing confrontation. And by the way, there's several different communication stuff. As a psychologist, I can use questions, I can use statements, I can use interpretations, and confrontation is one of them. So I was using confrontation as a clinical intervention relative to a persecutory delusion, a shared persecutory delusion. And so, but this is shifting now because confrontation is no longer necessary. It's all exposed. He's exposed. The mental illness is exposed. And I think in the dialogue, I want you to introduce this potentiality because this is where it needs to move. I'm not sure it will, but it needs to move here. Is Donald Trump has a mental illness. And that needs to be recognized, that he's a vulnerable person. This needs to move in a different direction. It needs to move in a healthcare direction rather than a political direction. And I would hope that his children and his supporters and his people allow that to occur. There will be, my guess is, an intense media push to get an interview with post-elected Trump. He'll likely give it. I would not necessarily. When that interview takes place, I would suggest some pre-consultation with the interviewer about this being a mental illness and some sensitivity relative to the type of mental illness you're dealing with. He will remain delusional. And so it's compassion. When we come into the healthcare issue with mental illness, whether it's schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, ADHD, autism, whatever it is, bring compassion. The person may be difficult. They may be difficult to live with. The child with autism, the schizophrenic young person with schizophrenia, but understanding it's a mental illness. It's pretty clear at this point that Donald Trump has a mental illness. They're talking about the 25th Amendment and removing him, which I knew it was always going to go there. I knew it was going to go to impeachment because he's going to do something, and so it'll go through impeachment, and then it'll go to the 25th Amendment. The question is, how soon does he get there? And pretty much the estimate was right about now. The only bifurcation point was at which point do his allies say enough? Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham. And at what point did they say enough? And they didn't. And so if you don't limit the narcissist, they just keep going and going and going, which is an important issue for the court to understand relative to narcissistic pathology. If you don't put structure and limit on it, they just keep going. Enforce your court orders. If you've got custody, adults should be able to maintain those, and children always should maintain court orders. So enforce your court orders, because otherwise you're just going to keep getting an escalation of this. So you want to know how this high conflict divorce winds up being in your courtroom for 3 or 4 years? You're not enforcing your orders. And you've got Donald Trump as one of the people. The other parent is chaotic, they're argumentative, they are impossible to work with. They're extremely destructive. They manipulate the child, get the child, turn the child against the other parent, Congress. And so it's like you have to put structure on these people. And the impeachment, you didn't put limits at any point in time. All you allies, enablers, you didn't put any limits on the narcissist, and they didn't see where we got. Same exact thing in the courts. We need to enforce your orders, Your Honor. And relative to that, let me explain to the judges. I used to work juvenile justice. And when I'm working with a kid on probation, if that kid violates probation, I want him to go back into the hall. Because if my kid violates probation and he's allowed to get away with it, that eviscerates my therapy. How can I teach that responsibility for what they did when they say, Dr. Childers, I got away with it? You're right. So you don't have to follow the probation orders. And that never happens. If they violate probation, boop, they go back, which is exactly what should happen and what I, as a therapist, want. Now, I don't want my kid in the juvenile hall. Hell no. But held accountable for following the probation orders because I need to teach them that. I need to teach them that they need to constrain themselves within the limits of the law, of court orders. And it's not a personal opinion. That's a court order. Follow it. But over here in family courts, you people don't follow your orders at all. The narcissist is allowed to violate custody exchanges. A child's allowed to, and the judge just goes, oh, okay, whatever. Because you're afraid of the child. The child's vulnerable. You're saying, the child doesn't want to be with that parent. Is that true? I don't know what's going on. Your Honor, no. If you got a court order, everybody should follow it. If you're worried about child abuse, get an assessment for child abuse specifically. In this case, it's psychological abuse. Child saying, oh, my other parent's mean to me, I don't want to be with them, that's psychological abuse. Well, get a specific assessment. Get mental health to tell you, is there child psychological abuse or is this a shared delusion? Is this that Trump cult with a QAnon? I got one parent who's got a persecutory and they're creating it in the child. And so which one is it? Or it could be real child abuse. So you want to find out, Your Honor. And so before making custody decisions, if you're worried about child abuse, get an assessment for it. It's not a custody assessment. You can decide on custody, Your Honor. It's either 50-50 roughly, or maybe every other weekend, or school year and vacation part if they're living apart. There's only so many choices, and I have confidence you can figure that out. It's the child abuse one that's got you a little sensitive, so get it assessed. Forensic psychology doesn't assess it. They're awful. So you got to get clinical diagnostic assessment because you need to know if it's a shared persecutory delusion. If you don't know that QAnon is crazy, you might wind up believing, is there really a pedophile ring that Donald Trump is protecting us from? And you're trying that in court. No, one parent is a little wacko. So the courts need to reevaluate how they approach family law and child custody issues with this new information about narcissistic pathology that becomes more evident to everybody. Now, it was evident to me because I work with narcissistic pathology and delusional stuff, so I knew, but I'm telling you, but nobody listens to me, so the court system continues to abuse children and continues to create the chaos. It's like the court system is living in an eternal attack on Congress. Okay, we have this mob in our Congress every day in the court system, day after day after day, and there's no security coming in to clear the people out, and nothing happens, and it's just mob rule. That's the family courts right now. So courts everywhere, across the Europe, Asia, everybody, take a look at Donald Trump, take a look at narcissistic pathology, take a look at delusions, shared delusions. Socially, we're going to need to address that issue of the shared delusion. You're going to see that moving forward. In family courts, we need to address the issue of diagnostic issue of a shared persecutory delusion. That needs to be assessed for, at least assessed. Your Honor, you need to know if this is a shared delusion rather than serious family conflict or pathology. Is one parent creating the pathology in the child? So moving forward, I want to just suggest or recommend or put into the mindset that in interpreting Donald Trump relative to history, relative to how we interact with him now and his supporters and the Trump mind cult, is that this is a pathology, this is an illness. A diagnosis of a delusional disorder is in the DSM-5. It is a psychiatric disorder. That moves it into the healthcare field. And I would encourage people to begin to, media, other people, to begin to shift in our interpretations a little bit relative to Donald Trump. In the parallel process, over to the court-involved stuff, for targeted parents, that applies to the allied parent. There's a lot of angry at that parent. They've destroyed your relationship with the child. They're doing all this stuff to just be a nightmare to try to work with. So a lot of anger, and I get that. At the same time, as we move forward in solving court-involved pathology, we need to stop attacking the allied parent, the vulnerable parent, the pathological parent, to prove how pathological they are. That's not helpful to the child. That's the child's mom or dad, and that's a parent who has a disorder. They have a vulnerability, a fragility, a psychological illness. And so recognizing that we have a child with a parent who has a mental illness, a fragility, we need to approach that with greater sensitivity on how we both protect the child, but do so in a way that doesn't have to so overtly bash the allied parent. And that will help with the court if we don't have to come out quite so forcefully in bashing the other parent. So euphemisms like vulnerable and pathogenic. When you hear the word pathogenic, that should be a little, we might be dealing with narcissistic pathology who's collapsing into a delusion. So if we don't have to explicitly tell you that, but you kind of know the keys and know where this is going, that would be helpful, because we want to restore the child's relationship with that parent. We want the child to have a relationship with the Republican Party. But the Republican Party's crazy. So we need the voter, the child, to understand the crazy part of the Republican Party and to be able to cope with it. Okay. And so over here, we need the parents a little bit off, and so we need the child to be able to cope with it, but we still want the child to have bond to that parent. We want the child to get as much love from that parent as possible. That's the issue. I'm not all that concerned about the child going that direction. It's the love from that parent that I want the child to get. And that's going to be a problem because they don't give much. They don't have much. Nothing, actually. So that's going to be a problem, but I want to get as much as I can for the child. That's mom, that's dad. There will always be mom and dad, and it's important for the child to have that bond. Even if it's a schizophrenic baby, bipolar, it doesn't matter. We do what we can to get as much as we can. And so that's what that is. The final point that I want to make, and we're coming on Facebook Live, is this pathology, narcissistic pathology, the collapse into delusions, is the rippling of transgenerational rippling of sex abuse trauma. Let me talk about it a little bit, this transgenerational trauma. You guys don't realize it, but trauma moves through generations, and we know, all the research shows that. We know that. And with this particular one, there's 4 child abuse diagnoses: physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, and psychological abuse. All of those are equal in the damage they do. They differ only in the type of damage, not in the severity of damage. So psychological abuse is extremely destructive. It destroys a child from the inside out. And so it's really destructive. And so if you want to know what to do with psychological abuse, just switch categories. What would you do with a child who's being beaten with electrical cords? Would you leave the child with that parent and say, well, we'll do reunification therapy for 6 months and every day the kid's going home to be beaten by electrical cords? No, you protect the child. Same thing. So the 4 diagnoses of child abuse here. Now, physical abuse. has ripples. It affects the child, who then affects the adult and affects their parent. Where does a ripple of physical abuse show up? In our juvenile justice system. Violence produces violence. So we see the ripple of physical violence in the juvenile justice system, or in the justice system generally. Where does sex abuse, child abuse show up? Where does that ripple show up? Doesn't. We don't see it anymore, because sex abuse is a hidden pathology. Typically, the little girl, men can be sexually abused for a while, but let's say the little girl is sexually abused. She doesn't disclose to anybody because involved and all sorts of psychological issues, domination and stuff. So she doesn't disclose, and so she never gets treated. It never gets resolved, and so she has unresolved trauma in her, and it's never been. And so it ripples out, but it's a hidden pathology. We never treat it. We never see it. And that's why the sex abuse protection advocates, like in the 80s, when responding to Gardner and his stuff, are so forceful in that disclosure aspect. We need that disclosure. Sex abuse is a hidden pathology. The key is to get that disclosure made. And the limiting factor is the shame and the allies. The allies will not support the disclosure. And so that's the whole issue on the sex abuse. Now, this pathology, this court-involved family conflict stuff that people call parental alienation, is the ripple of the sex abuse. Sex abuse is going to hit the attachment networks, and it's going to hit the intimacy, love and intimacy networks. And so when you have a divorce, that's going to trigger those traumas in the love and intimacy networks, and we will see the trauma of the sex abuse get rippled out during a divorce, in the divorce issue, in the breakup of a relationship. That's the trigger that will trigger the trauma to expose itself. So where will it show up? 95% of families somehow manage to get divorced and figure it out. 10% of families show up in high conflict divorce cases. That's the one. The high conflict one. That's a narcissistic borderline personality. That's a high conflict personality. That's showing up, the unresolved trauma. So you've, in court involved psychology over in your family courts, this high conflict divorce you talk about is the rippling of sex abuse. And you can see some of the themes coming through. The rejection of a parent. You never see that in any other pathology except sex abuse. Oh, and parental alienation. Interesting. The issue of protecting the child. You know, oh, I need to protect the child. There's an abusive parent, and that's the whole trauma narrative. Okay, and so it's getting imposed. The kabuki theater of the trauma reenactment kind of thing. Shame is, though, the core line on sex abuse. It's the generational transmission, sort of that shame, and sex abuse is a violence. It's a degradation of the child, and you can see that in Trump being so gleeful as his supporters desecrate the Capitol. It was all about desecration. It was about humiliating Congress, dominating Congress, and just shaming them. And degrading Congress. I'm sitting in your chair, Nancy, and it's a degradation component. And so you can see that with the pathology. And it's the same in the court-involved stuff. You don't deserve to be a mother. You're bad mother. You're shaming her. You know, your own child doesn't even love you. You're a bad father. You're abusive. And, you know, tell the teachers that you're domestic violence and shame you. Okay, so there's a strong shame line in this. And it's shaming the other person. And so you can see that he's trying to shame Congress, and they're trying to shame the targeted parent. They do, because they have to say, why doesn't your own child love you, kind of stuff. And so this is the issue, though, is it's their own shame that's rippling out of the sex abuse, and it's getting projected out. Proud Boys. I mean, it does not take a psychologist to see the unconscious motivation in that. It's about compensating for their inner shame. I'm a proud boy. I'm not like... Yeah, right. Okay. So, so this is a rippling of the sex abuse pathology. And that's important to understand, because we need to rejoin with the child advocates, child protection advocates. Gardner split us off from them with his irresponsible parental alienation syndrome and his statements about sex abuse with children and da da da. Massively irresponsible, massively wrong. But by doing that, he separated us from the child protection advocates because they're saying, no, we want disclosure. You can't discount disclosure. And they're right. We want disclosure of sex abuse. And so no, we don't discount sex abuse allegations. But we do investigate and diagnose them, and the differential is a shared delusion. So I might have sex abuse or I might have a shared delusion. And I got to look at both sides of that. So we're not just going to go and say, is there sex abuse? And, oh, there's no sex abuse. Well, okay, fine. Look at the other side. If sex abuse is there, then we may be looking at a shared delusion on this side. So if there's no sex abuse, look the other direction. That's what we need to be doing, but we're not. And so we need to rejoin with the child abuse because this is not a child custody issue. This is a child protection issue, which is why I'm taking such a hard stand on this, because I seem to be the only one who recognizes this is child abuse. The rest of forensic psychologists in the courts and everybody's willing to let these kids sit in child abuse for 6 months, a year, 2 years. And if you transfer categories, you're essentially letting the child be beaten with electrical cords for 6 months or 2 years while you figure out what to do. Yikes. No, get an assessment and get it done like timely way and get a good one. The assessment for a delusional history, it's not do I think, it's a mental status exam of thought and perception. It's frontal lobe executive function systems. If you don't know how to do a mental status exam of thought and perception, you shouldn't be working with delusional pathology, because how can you possibly diagnose it? But you are. In the court involved, you forensic psychology people are working with the but you don't know how to do a mental status exam of thought and perception, so you are incompetent and you are negligent because you didn't use proper care. Please, if you're working with delusions, please diagnose them. I think that's a relevant information for the court. If there's a delusion in the family and one parent's delusional and creating a shared delusion with the child, maybe you should diagnose it and tell the court. Kind of important for the court to know. So, I wanted to come on Facebook for a variety of reasons, but one of the reasons is things are transitioning right now because it's become clearly obvious that Donald Trump has a mental illness. And so I wanted to begin to shift the dialogue or shift the lines away from political lines over to more healthcare lines. My issue with Trump and Trump voter and politics are separate, and I'll deal with those separate. I'm massively disappointed in my fellow Americans who voted for Trump. You should have seen this. You did see this. You ignored it. You're racist. You're fascist, like a lot of stuff. But that's a day of reckoning that the United States has to have with itself. But I want to separate that a little bit from the issue of the healthcare issue. That on one side, Donald Trump has a mental illness. People need to recognize that. We need to move more in the mental health care direction with Trump rather than the politics and the anger. Although our laws need to be upheld, I think Merrick Garland will do a good job of that. We need to reestablish our justice system as fair and impartial, and we need to communicate that the that happened was not okay. Enforce your court orders. The other issue, though, is the parallel process. To use the collapse of Donald Trump's narcissistic pathology into the delusion and the shared delusion, to highlight for the courts and the family courts what the pathology is that you're dealing with. And look, he was president for 4 years. And you know he's difficult, but did you know how crazy he was? No. Okay, you need to get it diagnosed in the family courts. Okay, so don't wait till 2020 to get it diagnosed because you've left the child with this parent and crazy for 4 years. When that high conflict enters your court, get it diagnosed. See if it's here. See if we're looking at this crazy Trump campaign of shared delusion. Just figure it out at the start, because that's relevant information for you, Your Honor. And here's what I would recommend for the court, that all normal range people can follow court orders. Now, on a divorce, a normal family may need, this spousal stuff is conflict, but they should be able to keep that down, their own conflict, and figure out what the custody should be. So normal and healthy families, the parents figure out the custody schedule and they come in the court and the court kind of says, okay with it. That's normal. Now, abnormal is when we have one parent who can't do that. They can't cooperate. They can't put their child ahead of their own anger and stuff. And so then they need to go into the court and have the court decide on the custody around divorce. Now, that's not okay and normal, but it's understandable. There's a lot, and divorce, there's a lot of spousal stuff going on. So, and one parent may want more time than the other parent. So that's understandable. So the first round at divorce, it's understandable they come in and say, Your Honor, can you please decide on our custody schedule? I'd like this, the other one like that. When the court decides this is a custody schedule, every normal human will be able to abide by that. I may not like that I get every other weekend, but that's what I got. I'm going to live with that, and I'm going to do the best with it. And clinical psychology is fine with any schedule. So we can get healthy relationships off of any custody schedule. That's not relevant to the relationship. So do what you need when you do. Now, any normal should follow. Now, if it shows up a second time down the road and they're fighting still about custody about something, that's when the trigger is. Wait a minute, I got somebody who cannot follow my court orders. Let's have a look at this. Why? That's ACS, Associate Clinical Sign 12. There's something about authority of court orders going on here. We got custody conflict around the child. We got the child doing something, attachment pathology. Let's get it assessed. And the assessment is there child abuse on one side or is there psychological abuse on the other side, the shared delusion? That's your differential diagnosis you want answered, Your Honor. And so it's a very clean clinical assessment. It's a diagnostic assessment on clinical psychology. We can probably, clinical psychology get you back a diagnostic assessment in like a couple of weeks. And so it'd be a quick turnaround on the diagnostic assessments. It's a mental status exam of thought and perception. I've been court ordered to conduct them. I have conducted them. The court order included the order for a court reporter in my mental status exam. I love it. If I want all my mental status exams in court and pathology to have a court order or to have a court reporter present, I love the transcript. I can go down and explain to the court exactly where the delusion is, and the court can look at it and say, "Oh, yep, I see it." And so I did that. I was called up on a case. It took me 2 clinical interviews of about an hour and a half, and I had a turnaround on the report within a week. Okay, for the court. So that's what we need to be moving towards. Is a diagnostic assessment to give answers to the court about the key issue that the court wants. Is there a child abuse or is this a delusional disorder? And the court can then use that and make decisions about stuff. This issue of custody evaluations takes 6 to 9 months. By the time you get the answer back, it's 9 months later. It's useless. What's going on then? Plus, if there's child abuse, we've left the child in that for 9 months. We need a much more faster assessment. Psychology doesn't even return a diagnosis. So I'm telling you, and they're not. The key issue is whether this is a persecutory delusion, a Donald Trump cult mind taking over Congress, or do we have authentic child abuse? So forensic psychology doesn't even answer that question because they didn't do a mental status exam, thought perception look at. Why didn't they do it? Because they don't know it, because that's 2.04 and 2.01. They're not competent. So the standards in forensic psychology are substantially below those in clinical psychology. So I'm bringing clinical psychology back. I'm not a forensic, never be a forensic psychology. I have standard. So you want a diagnostic assessment of this pathology. And I think we can see why now. Because otherwise you're going to wind up with this. You're going to wind up with a chaotic situation and a child who is deeply damaged. We're going to be damaged, America, for years because of the Trump presidency and his chaos and his attack on us and assault. We're going to have psychological scars on our democracy from this because it wasn't addressed earlier. And so for the courts and family law system, use this as your indication, as your model to get on the family conflict and the abuse early so that we don't get to 4 years of chaos and Black Lives Matter and tear gassing people, to have a photo op, and Russian hacks, and all of this chaos for 4 years that have damaged America, and an attack on our democracy. We don't want that for the family and the child's development. We want the child to have a normal, healthy childhood. We don't want to put them through 5 years, 6 years of intense family conflict. So when the pathology enters your court system, Your Honor, you make your court orders. If they aren't followed, why not? So you need to follow my court orders first. Second, let's find out why you're having trouble. One parent thinks there's child abuse. Okay, let's look at that. The other parent thinks it's psychological control and manipulation, psychological child abuse. Okay, let's look at that. Okay, look at both sides. Get a diagnostic MSc of front and perception. Take a look at it, see what the diagnosis is, and then make your decisions about how to proceed on the custody situation. If you need somebody to tell you how to proceed in the custody, get a custody evaluation, I suppose, and get the opinion of a random person in psychology about what they think custody schedule should be. In clinical psychology, let me close with this. In clinical psychology, our custody recommendation all the time in clinical psychology is, in the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. In the absence of child abuse, parents have the right to parent according to their cultural values, their personal values, and their religious values. And professional psychology, and I would suggest the court, should not override that fundamental human right of parenting. In the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with the child as possible. If it's a bad parent or if there's conflict, that's a treatment issue, not a custody issue. So treatment depends on diagnosis. The treatment for cancer is different than the treatment for diabetes. So we need a written treatment plan for that. We need the diagnosis, so let's get an assessment. A differential diagnostic assessment. Is it child abuse on one side or is it child abuse on the other? We'll figure it out. Get a written diagnosis, get a written treatment plan. The court can consider it, order it, and then we can begin to move forward into a structure that solves the family conflict rather than continues the family law conflict or enables it to continue to develop. So I need to get on, do a little Facebook Live about the current situation, and we'll get through. First question I always ask myself, do I have a choice? If I don't have a choice, well, then I have a choice. I'll figure it out. So the chaos and COVID, do we have a choice? I guess not. We'll get through. So take care, people.